The dawn broke pale and quiet over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, but there was nothing peaceful about the fields beneath it. For 2 days, Gettysburg had been a cauldron of violence. A storm of shot and shell had claimed thousands of lives and left the once pastoral farmland littered with bodies, broken casings, and shattered fences. The humid July air carried the stench of gunpowder and decay, and the cries of the wounded still echoed from makeshift field hospitals where surgeons worked without pause. Men who had survived the first 2 days of slaughter now stared into the misty horizon, knowing the third would be worse. This was no longer just a battle. It was the crossroads of the entire war. Robert E. Lee rode among his officers with the same calm, deliberate demeanor that had earned him the fierce loyalty of his men. Yet behind that composed exterior was a man under immense pressure. Twice he had thrown his army against the Union lines, once on the right, once on the left, and twice he had been repulsed. His brilliant flank attacks, the maneuvers that had broken larger armies before, had failed to shatter George Meade's defensive positions. And with every passing hour, Lee's strategic situation grew more precarious. He was deep in enemy territory, far from his supply lines, and his opponent's army was swelling with reinforcements. Retreat now would mean more than just a lost battle. It would be an admission that the great Northern invasion, the bold gamble meant to bring the Union to the negotiating table, had failed. Still, Lee believed victory was within reach. From his vantage point on Seminary Ridge, he studied the Union position stretched across the opposite high ground on Cemetery Ridge. The blue line held firm on the flanks, where his men had already been bloodily repulsed, but the center appeared thin, or so Lee convinced himself. Reports from his scouts suggested that Meade, expecting another flanking attack, had shifted troops to the edges, leaving the middle vulnerable. A concentrated blow there, Lee reasoned, could split the Union army in two. If the center collapsed, the road to Washington might open, and with it, the political pressure for peace. His most trusted corps commander, James Longstreet, disagreed. The old warhorse had warned Lee that attacking entrenched infantry across nearly a mile of open ground would be suicide in the age of rifled muskets and improved artillery. But Lee, guided by a mixture of intuition, confidence, and perhaps desperation, overruled him. The war had reached a point where boldness, not caution, would decide its fate. If the Confederacy was to have any chance of forcing an end to the conflict, it had to strike here, on this ground, today. Across the valley, Union soldiers stirred from uneasy sleep. They had spent the night strengthening their positions, stacking fence rails into makeshift breastworks, piling rocks into low walls, and checking their ammunition. Many of them knew the enemy would try again, though none could guess where or when. They had fought like demons for 2 days, from the chaotic skirmishes of McPherson's Ridge to the savage hand-to-hand struggles in the wheat field and on Little Round Top. Their ranks were thinned, their uniforms torn and filthy, but their morale was unbroken. The Army of the Potomac had stood firm against the Confederacy's most audacious assault, and they were ready to do so again. As the sun climbed higher, both armies prepared in silence, each aware that the next few hours could shape the course of the entire conflict. Flags fluttered limply in the still morning air. Cannon stood silent but loaded, and men wrote hurried letters home, some sensing they would never send another. On the Confederate side, couriers carried orders to the divisions chosen for the task ahead. Pickett's fresh Virginians, Pettigrew's North Carolinians, Trimble's seasoned veterans, more than 12,000 men in all, who would soon march into history. No one could yet imagine the scale of what was coming. They could not know that the grassy field between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, a strip of ground barely a mile wide, would soon become one of the most infamous killing zones of the war. They could not foresee how courage, discipline, and blind obedience would collide with entrenched firepower in a storm of destruction, but all understood in some deep and wordless way that July 3rd, 1863, would not be just another day of fighting. It would be the day when the fate of a nation hung in the balance, and when the cost of ambition would be measured in blood. In the stillness of that Pennsylvania morning, as campfires burned low and the distant thud of artillery preparation echoed faintly across the ridges, Robert E. Lee turned his gaze toward the blue line on Cemetery Ridge. He had gambled before in this war, and each time audacity had been rewarded with triumph. At Chancellorsville, He had divided his army in the face of a superior foe, a decision that should have been disastrous, but instead became a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. That victory had convinced Lee of something deeper than battlefield mathematics. That boldness, faith in his men, and the sheer momentum of Confederate will could overcome any disadvantage. Gettysburg, he believed, would be no different. What Lee saw through his field glasses seemed to confirm his instincts. The Union line appeared stretched in the center, a shallow arc anchored by two strong flanks on Culp's Hill and Little Round Top. The previous day's fighting had drawn Federal reserves toward those ends of the line, leaving the middle, he thought, lightly defended. If he could strike with enough force, and at precisely the right point, the Union Army of the Potomac could be split in half. One part would be pinned against the rocky high ground south of town. The other would be forced to retreat north toward the town itself. In the ensuing chaos, his army could surge to the breach, roll up both wings, and seize a high ground. And if Meade's army disintegrated here, the road to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and even Washington would lie open before them. The Confederacy would have more than a victory. It would have leverage to demand recognition or negotiate peace. But Lee was not alone on the ridge, and not all shared his faith. James Longstreet, his most seasoned and trusted corps commander, studied the same ground and reached a very different conclusion. He saw nearly a mile of open field, gently sloping upward toward a fortified enemy position bristling with rifled muskets and artillery. He saw fences and farm walls that would break formation and slow the advance, and he understood that the Union's rifle artillery could rain destruction at ranges Napoleon could never have imagined. This was not 1805. He warned Lee. The era of glorious frontal charges was gone. Such a maneuver, he insisted, would doom thousands of men to die without ever reaching the enemy. But Lee's resolve did not waver. Perhaps he overestimated the exhaustion of the enemy after 2 days of battle, or underestimated the lethality of modern weapons. Perhaps he was driven by the weight of his own reputation, the belief, shared by his soldiers and by much of the Confederacy, that he could not fail. And perhaps, too, there was an element of desperation. Time was against him. Every day his army remained deep in Union territory increased the risk of encirclement or severed supply lines. Retreating after 2 failed assaults would not just be a tactical setback. It would be a blow to Southern morale and international credibility. Only a decisive victory could justify the cost of this campaign. Longstreet pressed his case once more, pleading for a maneuver around the Union left, forcing me to fight on ground of their choosing. But Lee shook his head. The ground had been reconnoitered, the artillery positioned, and the orders forming in his mind. The Union center would be the point of decision. A concentrated assault there, preceded by a massive artillery bombardment, would hammer the enemy into retreat. The plan was simple, even elegant in its geometry. 3 divisions under Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble advancing in echelon across the open field, converging like the closing jaws of a trap. To Longstreet, it felt like sending men into slaughter. To Lee, it felt like destiny. As the morning wore on, the plan took shape in crisp orders carried by couriers across the Confederate lines. Brigades formed and drilled in preparation. Officers polished their swords and readied their maps. Chaplains moved among the camps, offering prayers and blessings to men who would soon march into the storm. And though many soldiers sensed the enormity of the task ahead, they did not question their commander. Lee had led them through impossible victories before. Surely he would do so again. What none of them could fully grasp, not even Lee himself, was that this gamble was unlike any he had made before. It was not just a test of tactics or courage. It was a clash between 2 eras of warfare, one born in the age of cavalry and smoothbore muskets, and another forged by rifle barrels, entrenchments, and industrial firepower. The ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge would become the proving ground for that truth. And as the Confederate divisions prepared to march, they did so unaware that they were about to carry the weight of their nation's fate on their shoulders and into the teeth of an enemy waiting with modern fire and unyielding resolve. The morning hours passed with strange and suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like the long, drawn-out breath before a storm. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers leaned against stone walls and low earthen embankments, squinting across the undulating farmland that separated them from the distant tree line. There, through the thin haze of summer heat, Gray-clad figures moved deliberately among the shadows. They were too far to make out individual faces, but their intentions were unmistakable. Regiments were forming, flags unfurling, lines dressing into perfect alignment. Something was building in those woods. Something enormous. The veterans among the Army of the Potomac had seen attacks before, but this was different. There was a weight to the movements across the field, a precision that spoke of resolve rather than desperation. Officers raised their glasses and muttered grimly about the numbers they saw assembling. Entire brigades, not scattered skirmishers, were taking shape behind Seminary Ridge. To the east and west, cavalry patrols reported similar activity, batteries rolling forward, caissons being unlimbered, limbers stacked with shot and shell. It was not merely an assault that was coming. It was a set piece, a deliberate and massive strike that would decide the day. For the Union soldiers crouched behind their defenses, time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Men spoke little, their voices low and clipped when they did. Some joked darkly about the madness of the Confederates to march across that open ground, but their laughter was hollow. They all knew what those men were about to do, and they knew the price it would cost on both sides. Many took out their pocket testaments or wrote hurried notes to loved ones, pushing them into breast pockets where they might be found later. Others sat in silence, staring at the far ridgeline and trying to measure the distance in their minds. Nearly a mile of open, gently rising ground, broken only by a few fences, a meandering stream, and the occasional copse of trees. There was nowhere to hide out there, no cover from the storm that was surely coming. At around noon, the Confederates began rolling their artillery into position. From the Union lines, it looked like an endless procession of wheels and muzzles, 150 guns in all, stretching nearly 2 miles along Seminary Ridge. Gunners worked with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Sighting angles, cutting fuses, arranging ammunition in neat stacks beside the guns. The crews stripped down to their shirts in the summer heat, sweat darkening the cloth as they went about their deadly preparations. Each cannon, once placed, was aimed not at random but with surgical intent. At Union batteries, infantry concentrations, command posts. Lee and his artillery chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, were building the largest bombardment the continent had yet seen. From a vantage point of Union commanders like Winfield Scott Hancock, it was clear that this was no mere demonstration. The Confederate Army was preparing to stake everything on this final blow. Orders were passed down the Union lines to check ammunition, reinforce weak points, and hold fire until targets were well within range. Officers walked the line, clapping men on the shoulders, issuing calm, deliberate instructions, masking their own unease with routine discipline. Some soldiers stacked extra ammunition boxes beside their positions. Others filled their canteens one last time. They knew that once the firing began, there would be no time for anything but survival. The atmosphere on the ridges was unlike anything either side had experienced before. It was as if both armies understood they were participants in something larger than themselves, a confrontation that would echo far beyond the fields of Pennsylvania. The Confederates, assembling in perfect formations, were the embodiment of Lee's faith in courage and momentum. The Union soldiers, entrenched and resolute, were the living proof of a new kind of warfare, one defined by firepower, discipline, and a defensive strength of prepared positions. Then, slowly, a sound began to drift across the no-man's land between the armies. At first it was faint, a steady, rhythmic thump that seemed almost out of place amid the tension. Then it grew louder. Drums. Deep, deliberate drum beats rolled from the Confederate lines, marking time for men forming in the shadows. Flags rose above the tree-lean, red, blue, and battle-scarred, and the long gray lines began to move forward into final positions. Union soldiers watched it all in silence. They gripped their rifles a little tighter, adjusted their caps, swallowed dryly. No one spoke now. No one needed to. Across that mile of grass and sunlit air, they could see destiny taking shape, an assault so vast and deliberate that it seemed less a military maneuver than a force of nature. The wind carried the faint hum of men chanting prayers, the metallic rattle of bayonets fixing into place, and the clatter of artillery wheels locking into firing positions. The battlefield was ready. Every man on both ridges felt it in his bones. The next hours would decide not just the outcome of a battle, but the fate of a war. The signal was given just after 1 o'clock, a single cannon shot that cracked across the still air like a starting gun. A heartbeat later, the entire Confederate line erupted in fire. 150 guns thundered almost in unison, their combined roar rolling across the fields in a deafening, continuous barrage. The ground itself seemed to tremble with each concussion, dust lifting from the dry soil and drifting like smoke before the wind. For the men of both armies, it was as though the sky had opened and the earth itself was coming apart beneath them. The air quickly filled with the shriek of shells. Iron tore through the sky, trailing smoke and sparks as it arced toward the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge. Explosions blossomed along the ridgeline, throwing dirt, rock, and splinters wood high into the air. Fences were obliterated, trees shredded into jagged stumps, and entire sections of the landscape vanished beneath towering plumes of dust and fire. Union soldiers who had never witnessed such concentrated artillery before could only press themselves into ground and wait, their hands over their heads as shrapnel hissed overhead like swarms of angry hornets. For nearly 2 hours, the bombardment did not let up. The Confederate gunners worked with relentless precision, ramming powder and shell into red-hot barrels, swabbing them down and firing again. The guns grew so hot that water boiled when poured over them. Caisson teams rushed fresh ammunition forward under fire, horses collapsing from exhaustion or terror. The noise was so overwhelming that men shouted into each other's ears and could barely hear their own voices. To many, it seemed impossible that anything on Cemetery Ridge could survive such punishment, and yet much of it did. Despite the apocalyptic violence, most of the Confederate shells sailed too high, overshooting their targets and bursting harmlessly behind the Union lines. The elevation of the ridge and the smoke that quickly blanketed the battlefield made precise aim nearly impossible. Shells that should have torn through infantry formations exploded in empty fields or crashed into the rear areas where supply wagons and ambulances clustered. Some Union soldiers, huddled behind stone walls or lying prone in shallow trenches, realized they were safer than they had feared. The bombardment looked terrifying, but its bite was blunted by miscalculation and poor visibility. Union artillery commanders, veterans of countless battles, recognized what was happening and adapted quickly. Instead of answering the Confederate fire with their own full barrage, a tempting but costly response, they held back. General Henry Hunt, the Army of the Potomac's chief of artillery, ordered many of his batteries to cease firing altogether or fire sporadically to conserve ammunition. The enemy believed their guns were being destroyed. In reality, they were lying in wait, preserving their shot for the storm that everyone knew was coming next. Still, the psychological toll of the bombardment was immense. Men clutched the ground and prayed aloud. Horses screamed and thrashed in terror. The smell of sulfur and burned powder grew, so thick it coated tongues and throats. The sun, blazing overhead just an hour before, was now a dim, red disk behind a haze of drifting smoke. Messages had to be shouted or passed by runner. Bugle calls and drum signals were drowned out entirely. Even veterans who had endured Antietam and Fredericksburg said they had never seen anything like it. In the Confederate ranks, however, the mood was triumphant. Officers watched the smoke rising from the Union line and believed the enemy must be broken. Porter Alexander, Lee's young and brilliant artillery chief, sent word to Pickett that the time was nearly right. The infantry should prepare to advance. The enemy batteries, he believed, were silenced, their infantry battered and demoralized. The path to Cemetery Ridge, it seemed, was open, but appearances were deceiving. Beneath the drifting smoke, Union soldiers were very much alive. Their lines were battered but unbroken, their guns silent but ready. The veterans knew better than to rise or show themselves. They stayed low, cleaned their rifles, refilled their cartridge boxes, and waited with grim patience for the gray ranks they knew would soon emerge in the tree line. The Confederates had unleashed the most intense artillery barrage of the war, but had not shattered the Union line. It had merely marked the beginning of something far more terrible. As the guns finally began to fall silent near 3 o'clock, a hush descended over the battlefield once again. The rolling thunder faded into distant echoes, leaving only the hiss of smoke drifting over the scorched fields and the moans of the wounded caught between the lines. Men lifted their heads, ears ringing, eyes squinting through the haze. And there on the far ridge, dark shapes were forming once more. They were not artillerymen now. They were infantry, thousands of them, stepping out from the shadows, aligning their ranks, and preparing to walk straight into the heart of Union fire. The barrage had ended. The real battle was about to begin. The silence that followed the barrage was almost unnatural. After nearly 2 hours of relentless thunder, the sudden absence of sound left the men on Cemetery Ridge disoriented and tense. Their ears rang from the concussions, and the acrid taste of burned powder clung to their tongues. Smoke hung thick over the fields, turning the July afternoon into a dim, gray twilight. But beneath that uneasy quiet, hearts were pounding. Everyone knew the bombardment had only been the prelude. Something far worse was about to unfold. Union soldiers emerged cautiously from behind stone walls and shallow trenches, brushing dust and debris from their uniforms. Some took long swigs from their canteens. Others quietly replaced spent cartridges and checked bayonet fittings. The artillerymen swabbed the bores of their guns and adjusted their sights, murmuring short, clipped commands to one another. Their faces were grim and streaked with soot, but their eyes were steady. They had survived the heaviest shelling of the war. Now they braced for the inevitable assault that would follow. Across the mile-wide expanse of open farmland, the Confederate line stirred. The tree line on Seminary Ridge rippled with movement, shapes shifting through the haze as if the forest itself were coming alive. Then, slowly, the forms resolved into ranks of infantry. At first they appeared as a narrow gray line, ghost-like and distant in the drifting smoke. But as more units stepped forward, the line widened and deepened, stretching far beyond what the Union soldiers had expected. The sight drew gasps and curses from the blue-coated ranks. It was not a mere attack. It was an army on the march. 12,000 men stepped out into the open, shoulder to shoulder, dressed in faded butternut and gray. Their battle flags, tattered from previous fights but still defiant, rippled above them in the light wind. Officers on horseback rode behind the lines, swords raised, calling commands that vanished into the humid air. Drummers beat out the slow, deliberate cadence that kept the vast formation moving as one. The sun caught the glint of thousands of bayonets, turning the Confederate front into a field of steel. From a distance, it seemed less like an army and more like a tide rolling inexorably toward a Union line. For the men waiting on Cemetery Ridge, the sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Some soldiers muttered prayers under their breath. Others stared in disbelief at the sheer size and precision of the advancing host. Even veterans hardened by years of battle found themselves awed. The Confederates marched with machine-like discipline, stepping over fences and across shallow ditches without breaking formation. They did not rush. They did not waver. They simply moved forward, calm, determined, unstoppable. Officers along the Union line barked orders to hold fire. It was too early to waste ammunition. The enemy was still nearly a mile away, far beyond the effective range of their rifles. Instead, the defenders prepared. Artillery crews adjusted their fuses, readying shells to burst above the approaching ranks. Infantrymen lined up 2 and 3 deep behind stone walls, fences, and hastily piled earthworks. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of taut, electric stillness that comes just before lightning splits the sky. As the Confederates advanced, the scale of the assault became clearer. 3 divisions, Pickett's fresh Virginians on the right, Pettigrew's North Carolinians and Tennesseans in the center, and Trimble's battle-hardened brigades on the left, were converging into one massive column nearly a mile wide. In their path lay nothing but open ground, broken only by a handful of farm fences and a shallow swale halfway to the Union line. It was a killing field, and everyone knew it. Yet still they came, as if guided by an iron will stronger than fear itself. The silence of the battlefield deepened as the gray wave crept closer. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. Only the faint clatter of equipment and the rhythmic beat of drums carried across the field. The men in blue waited, fingers on triggers, eyes fixed on the distant line. Sweat ran down their faces, soaking their collars. Some clenched their jaws. Others gripped their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. This was the moment soldiers dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. The decisive clash that would either break the enemy or be their own undoing. Then, somewhere near the center of the Union line, A cannon fired. A single, sharp report that shattered the silence. It was quickly followed by another, then another, until the ridge erupted in flame and thunder. Shells screamed overhead, exploding among the approaching ranks and tearing gaps in the gray line. Men fell, banners dipped, but the formation closed and continued forward. The storm had begun, and with it, the fate of the battle, and perhaps the entire war, would be decided on that sun-scorched strip of Pennsylvania soil. The advance began like a slow, deliberate tide, a movement so measured and steady that for a moment it seemed unreal. 12,000 men stepped into the open, aligned in precise formation, their ranks stretching across the fields like a gray curtain sweeping toward Cemetery Ridge. Officers on horseback rode just behind the lines, shouting commands above the steady thrum of drums that set the pace. The men marched with bayonets fixed and muskets held tight to their chests, the July sun glinting off metal and sweat. Above them, battle flags fluttered proudly, each a symbol of home states and regiments that had followed Robert E. Lee through victories from Fredericksburg to Chancellorsville. Now they marched again, not toward another triumph, but toward a destiny none could yet name. Almost at once, the Union artillery found its range. The first cannonades thundered from the ridge, shaking the ground underfoot and sending geysers of soil and smoke into the air. Shells screamed across the open field, bursting among the advancing ranks with devastating effect. Entire files vanished in a heartbeat, shredded by ire and fire. Men were thrown to the ground, limbs torn away, bodies left sprawled in grotesque shapes. Yet the survivors did not stop. Without orders, they closed ranks, stepping over the fallen and pressing forward with grim resolve. The pace was slow, almost unnaturally so, about 100 yards every 2 minutes. But that was the nature of such a formation. Speed would break their line. Cohesion would keep it alive. The Confederates advanced shoulder to shoulder, their bayonets forming a glittering hedge of steel as they crossed fence lines, navigated ditches, and waded through tall, waist-high grass. Officers waved their swords in the air, urging the men onward with cries of "Forward!" and "Steady, boys!" The wounded called out behind them, some begging for water, others simply whispering prayers, but there was no time to stop. The assault had to move as one. Every step forward a step deeper into the jaws of hell. From the ridge, Union gunners worked like machines. They fired with precision and calm, swabbing barrels, ramming charges, cutting fuses, and firing again in a deadly rhythm. Solid shot tore through Confederate lines like scythes through wheat, cutting swaths of destruction dozens of men wide. Exploding shells showered them with shrapnel. Where the terrain funneled them into tighter formations, the killing grew even more intense. Bodies piled up in grotesque mounds. But the advance continued. The gray lines bent, but did not break. At about halfway across the field, the Confederates encountered the first major obstacle, a low wooden fence that zigzagged across their path. It was nothing more than a farmer property line, but it became a death trap. The men were forced to slow and clamber over it under relentless fire, bunching together into ideal targets. Union batteries, now loaded with canister, tin cans packed with iron balls, unleashed a storm of shot that tore into the dense ranks at point-blank range. The air filled with splinters, smoke, and screams, but still the line reformed on the other side. As they advanced closer to the Union positions, rifle fire joined the chorus of destruction. Blue-clad infantrymen, who had held their fire to conserve ammunition, now opened up in coordinated volleys. Many balls hissed through the air, striking men down by the dozens. Flags fell, only to be snatched up and raised again by another hand. Officers were shot from their saddles, and sergeants stepped forward to take command. Entire companies disappeared in seconds, but the momentum, that iron determination, pushed the survivors onward. To Union soldiers watching from behind their breastworks, the sight was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. They had never seen anything like it. Thousands of men advancing across an open field into certain death, their formation still intact, their banners still waving defiantly amid the carnage. They came on magnificently, one Northern officer later recalled. It was grand, it was terrible. Even hardened veterans felt a grudging respect for the sheer courage driving the assault forward. The final stretch of the march was the most brutal. With less than 400 yards to go, The Confederate lines were within range of concentrated musket fire and point-blank artillery. The air grew thick with smoke and iron. The wounded stumbled forward until they collapsed. Entire regiments were reduced to ragged clusters of men. But those who remained pressed on, their boots crunching over the bodies of their fallen comrades, their eyes fixed on a low stone wall at the crest of Cemetery Ridge, the thin blue line that stood between them and victory. It was no longer just a march. It was a test of will, a contest between discipline and death. And even as the ground beneath their feet became slick with blood, the men of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble refused to stop. Each step carried them closer to Union guns, and closer to a reckoning that would decide the fate of Lee's grand gamble once and for all. The moment the Confederate line came within effective musket range, the world seemed to erupt. Until then, the steady, rhythmic pace of the march had been punctuated only by the thunder of distant artillery. Now, suddenly, the crest of Cemetery Ridge exploded with flame and sound. From behind stone walls and earthen mounds, Union infantry rose and unleashed a coordinated volley that tore into the advancing ranks like a physical force. Hundreds of men were cut down in the first seconds, collapsing in tangled heaps or flung backward by the impact of the many balls. The air filled with the sound of tearing cloth, shattering bone, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the ground. The range was close enough now that the rifles were deadly accurate. Each man in the Union line fired, reloaded, and fired again with mechanical precision. The familiar motions drilled into muscle memory over years of training in battle. Clouds of acrid white smoke rolled forward from their muzzles, obscuring the field and choking lungs, but they never stopped. "Aim low," shouted officers as they paced behind the lines. "Make every shot count." Each new volley punched deeper holes into Confederate formation, tearing regiment apart before they could even close the distance. The effect on the attackers was catastrophic, but the line did not collapse. It shuddered, staggered, and reformed as if driven by someone stronger than flesh. Men stepped into the gaps where their comrades had fallen, closing ranks without hesitation. Flags dipped and then rose again as one color-bearer after another was shot down and replaced. The formations that had marched so perfectly from the ridge were now ragged and bloodied, but they kept moving forward, inch by inch, step by brutal step. Officers screamed themselves hoarse trying to hold the advance together. Some waved their swords and pointed toward the Union line, urging their men onward. Others pushed soldiers forward with the flats of their blades, shouting curses and encouragement in the same breath. Horses bolted as bullets hissed past their ears, but riders clung on, trying to maintain control amid the chaos. The battlefield was a hell's cape now, thick with smoke, filled with metallic whine of lead slicing to the air and the terrible cries of the wounded. The mini-ball was an unforgiving killer. Its soft lead flattened and splintered on impact, tearing through flesh and bone with horrifying effect. Men hit in the arm or leg were often dead within minutes, the wounds too catastrophic for the primitive field medicine of the day. Those struck in the torso dropped instantly, their rifles falling from their hands as they clawed at the earth. Still, their comrades stepped over them, driven by orders, pride, and the desperate hope that enough of them might survive to breach the Union line. Union artillery joined the slaughter. With the Confederates now within canister range, the gunners loaded their barrels with tins of iron balls and sent them screaming into the oncoming ranks. The effect was devastating, as if giant scythes were swinging across the field. Whole sections of the attacking line simply vanished, reduced to mangled bodies and drifting smoke. Yet still impossibly, the advance continued. The defenders watched in awe and horror. Many had faced Confederate assaults before, but nothing like this. The sheer determination of the attackers defied belief. They came on as if nothing on earth could stop them, one Union soldier would later recall. Every time a line went down, another rose in its place. Some Union men even shouted warnings to their enemies, urging them to turn back, but the tide of gray ignored them. The assault had become something beyond tactics or orders. It was now a test of will, a brutal, unrelenting push against death itself. The field between the lines was now a charnel house. Smoke clung low to the ground, swirling around the dead and dying. The heat of the July sun mingled with the heat of the guns, baking the earth into cracked, blood-soaked clay. Everywhere there was motion. Men crawling, limping, staggering forward through the storm, some with their uniforms torn to ribbons, others with their faces and hands slick with blood. Closer and closer they came, their numbers thinning with every step. The Union infantry fired until their shoulders ached and their barrels burned hot to the touch. Officers barked orders to rotate firing lines, keeping up a constant, rolling wall of lead. The roar of musketry merged with the boom of artillery into one unbroken, thunderous chorus. And still the Confederates advanced, their banners visible now through the haze, their faces grim and resolute. By the time the leading edge of the charge had closed to within a few hundred yards, the gray line that had once stretched across the field was reduced to fragments, battered but unbroken, bloodied but still pressing forward. It was no longer an orderly march. It was a desperate, savage crawl toward the enemy's heart, through a storm of steel and fire that should have annihilated them. Yet for all the horror of that deadly wall, they refused to turn back. They had come too far to stop now. The battlefield narrowed as the Confederate charge pushed closer to Union line, the once broad sweep of gray shrinking as regiments were funneled to a single, fateful point, a low, jagged stone wall near a bend in the Federal defenses known as the Angle. The land itself seemed to conspire against the attackers. Gentle rises, broken fences, and converging lines of Union artillery all guided them into that deadly pocket, where the full weight of Northern firepower waited. Here, the storm reached its most ferocious pitch. The air was thick with smoke and filled with a dull, ceaseless crack of musketry. Shells from nearby batteries screamed overhead and burst among the advancing ranks, showering the ground with shards of iron. What had begun as a grand, sweeping assault now became a desperate struggle for mere yards of blood-soaked soil. As the Confederate brigades closed within 100 yards, the Union line erupted with a concentrated fury unlike anything seen before. Entire regiments rose and fired point-blank into the packed gray formations. The effects were devastating. Columns of men disintegrated where they stood, their ranks shredded by a storm of lead. But the momentum of the charge did not break. They were too close now, too committed, and the force of their forward motion carried them onward to the hail of fire. Men ran, stumbled, clawed their way over fallen comrades and shattered fences. The ground beneath their boots was slick with blood and littered with discarded weapons, broken equipment, and the bodies of the dead and dying. At last, the leading edge of the charge reached the stone wall. The crash was immediate and violent, two opposing tides colliding in a surge of chaos. The carefully drilled firing lines dissolved in an instant. Bayonets, once gleaming points of steel held in disciplined formation, became tools of raw, primal combat. Soldiers stabbed and thrust at shadows in the smoke, driving cold steel into bodies at arm's length. When bayonets broke or knocked aside, men swung their rifles like clubs, smashing skulls and shoulders with brutal efficiency. Some grappled barehanded, choking and striking with fists, boots, and anything else they could wield. The angle became a maelstrom of humanity. Flags clashed over the wall as color-bearers fought and fell within feet of each other. Confederates surged over the rocks, only to be driven back by desperate Union counterattacks. The defenders, their backs to the ridge and with no room to retreat, fought with ferocity born of necessity. The attackers, having crossed nearly a mile of deadly ground and suffered unspeakable losses, refused to yield now that their goal was within reach. The result was slaughter, close, personal, and merciless. Artillery units stationed nearby turned their guns inward, firing canister directly into melee at almost suicidal range. The blast tore friend and foe alike apart, but still they fired, desperate to halt the Confederate momentum. Smoke rolled across the field so thick that men could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Orders were shouted and lost. Regiments mixed and scattered, and individual soldiers fought not as part of an army, but as men trying to survive a whirlwind of violence. Some Confederates did manage to breach the wall, clambering over the jagged stones and driving into the heart of the Union position. For a few brief, terrible moments, gray and blue were intermingled in a seething mass of struggle. A Union officer described the scene later as a storm cloud come to earth, all rage and lightning and death. At the center of that storm, soldiers fired pistols at point-blank range, swung sabers in tight arcs, and used ramrods as spears when their rifles jammed. It was a kind of fighting few had imagined when the charge began, chaotic, intimate, and utterly without mercy. Every inch of ground around the angle was paid for in blood. The stone wall, once just another feature of the Pennsylvania landscape, became a landmark of carnage. Soaked red and slick with the weight of the dead, men collapsed across it, hands still gripping rifles they would never fire again. Others dragged themselves forward on elbows and knees, refusing to stop even as their strength failed. Officers fell where they stood, their last orders drowned out by the relentless roar of combat. And yet, despite their courage and fury, the Confederate momentum was faltering. Every push over the wall was met with a counterpush. Every foothold seized was contested. Union reinforcements poured into the breach from nearby positions, fresh regiments throwing themselves in the fight with bayonets fixed and rifles leveled. The attackers were now exhausted, bloodied, and outnumbered, their formations shattered and their strength spent. The once proud wave that had rolled so confidently across the field was now reduced to scattered pockets of desperate men fighting with dwindling ammunition and sheer willpower. The battle at the angle had become the heart of Pickett's charge, a crucible where courage clashed with resolve and where the future of the Confederate cause hung in the balance. But even as men continued to fight and die on that small patch of ground, the tide was already beginning to turn. The wall that had drawn them forward, like a beacon of victory, was becoming their grave. The fighting around the angle had reached a fever pitch by the time Brigadier General Lewis Armistead arrived at the front. The Confederate assault was teetering on the edge of collapse. Its once proud formations now reduced to scattered knots of exhausted, blood-soaked men locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The air was choked with powder smoke so thick that visibility was measured in feet, and the roar of battle had become a single unbroken wall of sound. Musket fire, cannon blasts, shouted orders, and the screams of the wounded blending into something almost unrecognizable. It was here, in the midst of that chaos, that Armistead made his desperate gamble. Armistead was already a legend among his men, a soldier's general, known for his bravery and calm under fire. He had seen friends and fellow officers fall all around him, and he knew that the assault was faltering. Yet he refused to accept defeat. Raising his sword high, he pulled his hat from his head and impaled it on the blade, holding it aloft as a rallying signal. Then, with a shout that cut through the din of battle, he surged forward, climbing the low stone wall that had become the focal point of the fight. "Come on, boys," he roared. "Give them the cold steel." The sight of their general charging ahead reignited the Confederate line. Men who moments before had been pinned down by relentless fire now found a surge of strength. They followed Armistead over the wall, clambering past the bodies of their comrades and crashing headlong into Union position. For a brief, electrifying moment, the impossible happened. Confederate flags rose above the wall and waved inside the Union line. Officers on the northern side shouted orders to pivot their regiments, and Union soldiers who had spent hours holding the position suddenly found themselves fighting for it. The attackers were inside. This was the moment Robert E. Lee had envisioned when he ordered the assault, the moment when the Union center would crack and the Army of the Potomac would split apart. For those watching from afar, it must have seemed as though victory was finally within Confederate grasp. Armistead and his men pressed forward into the Union interior, driving back blue-clad infantry with bayonets and musket fire. A Union battery near the copse of trees was overrun, and its guns briefly fell silent. Officers shouted for reserves, and runners dashed through the smoke, carrying frantic messages along the lines. The breach was real, but victory, like the flags waving briefly behind Union defenses, was fleeting. The Confederates who made it over the wall were a shadow of the force that had begun the charge. Their ranks were shattered, their numbers too few. Ammunition was running low, and many had resorted to scavenging cartridges from fallen comrades. Every step deeper into the Union position stretched their already thin lines further apart, and the Union response was swift and overwhelming. Fresh regiments, held in reserve behind the ridge, were now rushing forward. Artillery batteries, some of which had feigned destruction during the bombardment hours earlier, roared back to life, their canister fire tearing into the exposed flanks of the Confederate wedge. The ground inside the Union line turned into a killing zone. Armistead, still urging his men on, was struck down by rifle fire and fell mortally wounded near one of the captured guns. Around him, the remnants of his brigade fought with desperate fury, But it was clear that the momentum had shifted. The Union soldiers, fueled by the knowledge that their line could not break here, counterattacked with ferocity. Bayonets clashed, musket butts swung like hammers, and hand-to-hand fighting raged among the guns and earthworks. Slowly, relentlessly, the Confederates were pushed back. To the men on both sides, it was obvious that they were witnessing a pivotal moment, the high water mark of Confederate cause. It was here, amid the smoke and screams and broken bodies at the angle, that the Army of Northern Virginia reached its deepest penetration into Union territory. It was here that the bold gamble Lee had envisioned came closest to success. And it was here, too, that it began to unravel beyond repair. The Confederate flags that had flown triumphantly behind Union lines began to falter. One by one, they were shot down or pulled back as their bearers fell. The men who had followed Armistead's lead now faced the grim reality that there would be no breakthrough, no split in the Federal line, no road to Washington. The Union defense held firm, unyielding under the pressure, and the tide of battle shifted irrevocably. As the shattered remnant of Armistead's command were pushed back toward the stone wall, the smoke cleared enough for both sides to see the devastation left in the charge's wake. The open field behind them was littered with thousands of bodies, the gray and the butternut blending into the summer grass. What had begun as a bold, sweeping assault had ended in a handful of men, surrounded and dying on foreign soil. For the Confederacy, the moment of greatest hope had passed, and with it, the dream of victory in the North. The breach at the angle lasted only moments, but in those moments the future of the battle, and perhaps the war, hung in the balance. Confederate flags waved defiantly behind the Union line, and for a fleeting heartbeat it seemed that Robert E. Lee's bold gamble might succeed. But the Union Army had not been broken, and the defenders, far from panicking, reacted with lethal precision. Officers shouted orders down the line, and reserve regiments that had been held just behind the crest of Cemetery Ridge now surged forward to run, bayonets fixed and rifles loaded. They moved with a discipline born of desperation, forming new lines within yards of the breach. What had been a vulnerable gap moment before was rapidly becoming a killing ground. The first wave of counterfire came from the artillery. Union batteries that had held their fire during the Confederate charge now swung their barrels toward the clumps of gray uniforms surging through the smoke. At this close range, they did not bother with explosive shells. They switched to canister, the deadliest ammunition of all. Each blast from a cannon now fired hundreds of iron balls in a single devastating cone, shredding everything in front of it. Confederate ranks that had held together through a mile of musket fire and artillery bombardment were torn apart in an instant. Men were cut down in rows, bodies hurled backward, as the air filled with a sickening rain of blood and splintered bone. The effect was immediate and horrifying. What had been a coherent assault line dissolved into chaos. Soldiers who moments before had been pressing forward with bayonets ready now stumbled over the dead and dying, losing cohesion under the relentless storm. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to reform their companies, but the roar of the guns drowned out their voices. Smoke from the cannons rolled thick across the field, mixing with the acrid haze of musket fire and the choking stench of blood and powder. Then the infantry joined in. Union soldiers along the ridge, many of whom had waited silently as their comrades bore the brunt of the initial assault, now rose and poured volley after volley into the disorganized Confederate masses. At ranges so close that even the greenish recruit could not miss, the mini balls smashed through ranks of gray, cutting down 2 and 3 men with a single shot. Some regiments fired so rapidly that their barrels glowed red-hot, and the recoil battered their shoulders raw. Yet they did not stop. Each volley drove the attackers back another step. For the Confederates, the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. They had crossed the field under the heaviest fire imaginable, breached the Union line, and even planted their flags inside the enemy's defenses, but they were exhausted, outnumbered, and outgunned. Ammunition was running low. Many had fired their last cartridges in the charge itself, and now resorted to scavenging from the fallen, or using their bayonets in close combat. Even so, they fought with desperate courage, refusing to yield ground without a struggle. Small groups clustered behind the stone wall, firing wildly into the advancing Union reinforcements. Others charged forward again and again, only to be thrown back by point-blank volleys and brutal counterattacks. The stone wall that had once seemed the key to victory was now a trap. Confederate soldiers who had crossed were caught between the relentless fire from the ridge ahead and the concentrated musketry from Union units on either flank. The very terrain that had funneled them toward the breach was now sealing their fate. There was nowhere to retreat without exposing themselves to even more devastating fire. The open field behind them, once filled with marching men and waving flags, was now a wasteland of bodies and wreckage. The relentless counterfire turned the tide completely. What had once seemed an unstoppable tide of gray was now a desperate, faltering mass. Regiments that had begun the charge with hundreds of men were reduced to a handful. Flags that had been held aloft through a mile of slaughter were lowered as their bearers fell one by one. Officers who had led bravely from the front were dead or dying, and those who remained could no longer maintain control of their shattered commands. By late afternoon, the Confederate presence beyond the wall was measured not in brigades or regiments, but in scattered groups of survivors clinging to patches of ground. Each attempt to push forward was met with another blast of canister or another volley of musket fire. Even the most determined soldiers could see the hopelessness of the situation. They were surrounded by death, hemmed in by fire, and cut off from any chance of reinforcement. The wave that had surged so boldly across the fields of Gettysburg had broken against the unyielding stone of a Union defense. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the charge began to collapse. Men turned back, some crawling, some limping, others dragging the wounded with them. The cry of retreat was never officially given, but spread along Confederate line nonetheless. What had begun as a bold attempt to shatter the Union Army now devolved into a desperate struggle to survive. And as the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, it was clear to all who stood on that field that the tide of battle, and perhaps the tide of the war, had irrevocably turned. The moment that had begun with drums and banners, with cries of "forward" and the steady rhythm of marching feet, was now dissolving into chaos. There was no trumpet blast, no shouted command to retreat. Lee had issued no such order, and none of the surviving officers dared give it. But every man on the field could see the truth written in blood and smoke. The charge had failed. The line that had once surged forward with such terrible purpose now buckled and broke under the unrelenting weight of Union fire. Where soldiers had once pressed on with bayonets leveled and flags held high, they now stumbled backward, dazed and bloodied, tripping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. It was a retreat without direction or dignity, not a rout, but a slow, painful unraveling of what had once been the pride of the Army of Northern Virginia. The field they had crossed so confidently less than an hour before was now a killing ground. The fences and ditches that had barely slowed them on the way forward now became obstacles in their desperate flight. Union artillery, no longer needing to conserve ammunition, thundered ceaselessly, hurling shell and canister into the retreating ranks. Each explosion sent men sprawling. Each volley tore new holes in formations that were no longer formations at all. The wounded crawled for the tall grass, their uniforms soaked in blood and dust, dragging themselves inch by inch toward the safety of the tree line they had left behind. Some cried out for water. Others called for their mothers, their wives, their God. Many simply lay where they had fallen, too weak to move, staring blankly into the sky as the battle raged on without them. The cries of the dying mixed with the sharp crack of rifles and the boom of artillery, a grim chorus that rolled across the Pennsylvania countryside. For the men still able to walk, the retreat was a gauntlet. The same open ground that seemed so vast and empty before now felt endless, stretching on forever under the relentless fire of Union guns. Many balls hissed overhead and tore through the air around them. Shell fragments screamed past, throwing earth and blood into the air. Groups of survivors clustered together for mutual support, hauling the wounded between them or leaning on one another as they stumbled back toward their lines. Officers who had once led their men forward now waved their swords toward the rear, urging the living to move faster. Some refused to leave. A handful of officers and enlisted men turned to face the enemy one last time, determined to fight to the end rather than retreat. They formed ragged firing lines behind shattered fences or took cover in shallow depressions, firing until their ammunition was gone and their rifles too foul to load. Their resistance did nothing to change the outcome, but bought precious moments for others to escape. In the chaos, Acts of courage and sacrifice unfolded quietly. A sergeant carrying his wounded captain on his back, a drummer boy using his canteen to wet the lips of a dying comrade, a flag bearer refusing to let the banner touch the ground even as blood ran down his arm. But courage could not reverse the tide. The charge that had begun with 12,000 men now counted only a fraction still standing. Some units returned to Seminary Ridge with fewer than 1 in 4 their number. Pickett's division, once the pride of Virginia, was shattered, its officers dead or wounded, its regiments reduced to scattered survivors. Pettigrew's and Trimble's commands were in no better shape. The proud brigades that had stepped off the line shoulder to shoulder were now broken, their banners tattered, their ranks decimated. Union soldiers watched the retreat in silence. Many lowered their rifles, unwilling to fire on men who were no longer a threat. Others continued to shoot, driven by anger, fear, or the grim logic of war. A few even shouted words of respect across the field, their voices carrying faintly through the smoke. "You fought well. Go home, boys." It was a strange moment, a mix of hatred and admiration, of victory and sorrow. By the time the last survivors staggered back into the safety of Confederate lines, the sun was dipping low in the western sky. The field they left behind was a vision of ruin. Thousands of bodies lay strewn across the grass. Gray and blue mingled together in death. Broken muskets and shattered artillery wheels littered the ground. Flags that had once waved defiantly now lay crumpled in the mud beside the men who had carried them. The breeze carried the sickly sweet stench of blood and powder over the ridges. There had been no official retreat and no formal surrender, but everyone knew what had happened. The greatest charge of the war, the boldest gamble Lee had ever made, had ended in catastrophe. The Army of Northern Virginia had reached the high water mark of its strength and been broken against the immovable stone of the Union line. And as the survivors limped back into the gathering twilight, they did so with the terrible knowledge that they had given everything, and it had not been enough. The survivors who staggered back to Seminary Ridge bore little resemblance to the proud soldiers who had stepped off the line an hour earlier. Their uniforms were torn and blackened by powder. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, streaked with grime, blood, and disbelief. Many carried the wounded on makeshift stretchers fashioned from broken muskets or torn blankets. Others clutched their rifles loosely, no longer with the determination of men ready to fight, but with the dull reflex of those who had seen too much death to care. The brigades that had once formed perfect lines of battle now limped back as scattered clusters, silent except for moans of the injured and the shuffling of boots through trampled grass. It was into this somber procession that General Robert E. Lee rode. His horse moved at a slow, deliberate pace, weaving to the tattered remnants of what had been the Confederacy's most daring assault. Lee's face was grave but composed, his posture as erect and dignified as ever. Officers saluted as he passed, but many of the men simply looked up with hollow eyes, unsure whether to salute, speak, or look away. Their commander, the man they revered as almost infallible, had asked them to do the impossible, and they had tried. They had given everything, and they had failed. Lee did not chastise them. He did not speak of cowardice or defeat. Instead, he removed his hat and spoke quietly, his voice carrying just enough of those nearby to hear. "It is my fault," he told them. "It is all my fault." The words, so simple yet so heavy, rippled through the ranks. Officers repeated them to their men, and they spread from group to group until even the most distant survivors knew that their commander was taking the burden upon himself. For many, that admission, that rare humility from a man they considered larger than life, was both a comfort and a sorrow. He rode up to one shattered regiment, now little more than a company. Barely a quarter of them had returned from the charge. Their colors were torn and blackened, their ranks decimated. Lee dismounted and walked among them, shaking hands, speaking softly to individual soldiers. "You did all that was asked of you," he said. "You were magnificent." To a young private who apologized for retreating, Lee placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said gently. "We must all do our duty, and mine was to direct you better." But no words, however kind, could mask the enormity of the disaster. In less than an hour, more than 6,000 Confederate soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Whole companies had been wiped from existence. Pickett's division, the pride of Virginia, was gutted, Pettigrew's men had been torn apart by canister and rifle fire before they ever reached the stone wall. Trimble's brigades had fought bravely, but were shattered by the counterattack. The ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge was now a vast graveyard, a testament to the futility of the assault and the terrible cost of Lee's gamble. Lee's staff urged him to retire from the field and rest. He refused. Hour after hour, he remained in the saddle, riding back and forth along the lines, speaking with every group of returning soldiers he could find. He offered words of encouragement, gave orders for the wounded to be cared for, and reassured his men that the army would fight another day. His calm demeanor did more to restore morale than any speech could have. Even in defeat, Lee was unshaken, a steady presence amid chaos. But beneath that composed exterior, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him. He had believed that the Union center was vulnerable. He had dismissed Longstreet's warnings and underestimated the strength of the Federal defenses. His audacity, the very quality that had delivered so many victories, had led him astray. And now, the Army of Northern Virginia was paying the price. The invasion of the North, so full of promise just days earlier, had ended in ruin on the fields of Gettysburg. As dusk settled over the ridge and the cries of the wounded faded into the distance, Lee stood beside his horse and looked out across the field where so many of his men now lay. The setting sun cast long shadows over the shattered landscape, and in that fading light, the reality of what had happened was impossible to escape. The high water mark of the Confederacy had been reached, and it had broken against the stones of Cemetery Ridge. Still, Lee's resolve did not falter. He turned back toward his staff and issued quiet, steady orders to the army to prepare for a possible Union counterattack. He knew they would not pursue him that night. Meade's forces were as battered and exhausted as his own, but he would be ready all the same. Whatever the cost, whatever the losses, the fight was not over. And as the remnants of Pickett's charge melted into the gathering darkness, the general who had sent them forward resolved to bear the weight of their sacrifice alone. When the last shots faded and the smoke began to drift away from Cemetery Ridge, a strange stillness fell over the Union lines. It was not the jubilant roar that often followed a hard-fought victory, nor the chaotic din of pursuit. It was silence, deep, heavy, almost reverent. The men who had stood shoulder to shoulder behind the low stone walls and earthworks, firing until their barrels burned and their ears rang, now found themselves staring across the open field in disbelief. The charge they had witnessed, the sheer scale of it, the courage it demanded, the devastation it invited, seemed almost beyond comprehension. The field before them was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard, where just an hour before 12,000 Confederate soldiers had stepped off in perfect formation, there were now only scattered clusters of men retreating under the pitiless afternoon sun. Thousands lay still, their gray and butternut uniforms blending with the trampled summer grass. Broken flags lay in the dirt, their staffs splintered. Muskets were scattered everywhere, many still loaded, dropped from lifeless hands. Even the birds that had fled at the first cannon blast had not yet returned. The land itself seemed stunned by what it had just witnessed. Some Union soldiers, their adrenaline still high and their hands trembling from the sustained musket fire, let out cheers, sharp, triumphant shouts that rolled briefly down the line. They had done what many had doubted was possible. They had held the center against the full weight of Lee's assault. They had stopped what was meant to be the decisive blow of the campaign, and, in doing so, had likely turned the tide of the entire war. For them, the victory was real, and it was overwhelming. But the cheers did not last long. They faltered, grew quiet, and were replaced by a solemn murmur. Others could not bring themselves to cheer at all. Hardened veterans, men who had fought at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, now stood with their rifles lowered, staring at the field with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The enemy had been brave, impossibly brave. To march across nearly a mile of open ground under relentless artillery and rifle fire, to continue forward as thousands fell with every step, to reach the stone wall itself and fight hand to hand. It was a kind of courage that even their bitterest foes could not deny. Some Union soldiers removed their caps in quiet respect. Others murmured prayers for the dead and dying, unable to look away from the human cost of their victory. For officers who watched the assault unfold from the ridge, the experience was no less sobering. General Winfield Scott Hancock, who had directed much of the defense, was gravely wounded but refused to leave the field until the fighting was over. He surveyed the devastation through bloodshot eyes, his voice hoarse as he gave orders to hold positions and tend to the wounded. "They came bravely," he said quietly to one of his aides, "and they died bravely." The remark spread quickly among the ranks, encapsulating what many felt but could not put into words. Even the most hardened artillerymen, men who had loaded and fired canister into the advancing ranks at point-blank range, found themselves shaken by the sight. They had watched entire regiments vanish in the smoke, had seen men march straight into storms of iron that no human being should have been able to endure, and yet still they had come on. It was one thing to defeat an enemy in battle. It was another to witness that kind of sacrifice and know that victory had been purchased at such a terrible price. In the hours that followed, details of the Confederate losses began to spread through the Union camps, and the enormity of what happened sank in. Of the 12,000 men who had stepped off from Seminary Ridge, more than half were dead, wounded, or captured. Pickett's division was practically annihilated. Entire regiments had ceased to exist. The scale of the slaughter defied imagination, and it left even the victors shaken. As stretcher-bearers ventured out under flags of truce to retrieve the wounded, Union soldiers watched their former enemies with a new kind of respect. They passed water to Confederate prisoners, offered bandages where they could, and in some cases even shared food from their haversacks. The bitterness of 3 days of brutal combat could not erase the strange bond that formed between men who shared the same hell. When night finally fell over Gettysburg, the Union soldiers laid down in their camps with the knowledge that they had won. But their victory felt unlike any they had known before. It was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment of reflection, of quiet reckoning with the reality of what war demanded from those who fought it. The field below them, littered with the bodies of men who had marched fearlessly into death, was a testament not only to their own endurance, but to the shared humanity of friend and foe alike. And as a cool evening breeze drifted across Cemetery Ridge, even the most jubilant voices fell silent. The guns had fallen silent by the morning of July 4th, 1863, but their echoes lingered across the rolling fields of Gettysburg. Smoke drifted in thin gray veils above the ridges, and the humid summer air carried the heavy, bitter scent of blood and gunpowder. In the distance, stretcher parties from both armies moved slowly across the battlefield, weaving among the countless dead and wounded left behind by Pickett's charge. What had begun as Robert E. Lee's boldest gamble, a strike meant to shatter the Union line and end the war on Southern terms, now lay broken amid the shattered remnants of his army. The Confederacy had not just lost a battle. Something deeper, more fundamental, had been lost as well. For 2 years, Lee's army in Northern Virginia had seemed unstoppable. It had outmaneuvered, outfought, and outthought every Union general sent against it. At places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, smaller Confederate forces had humiliated larger Northern armies, reinforcing a powerful belief both at home and abroad, that Southern valor and superior leadership could overcome Northern numbers and industrial might. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania was meant to be the crowning proof of that belief, a dramatic strike that would bring the war into the North's heartland, sap Union morale, and perhaps even force Abraham Lincoln to negotiate. But Gettysburg shattered that illusion. Pickett's charge had been more than a tactical maneuver. It was the embodiment of Confederate confidence, the living symbol of a cause that believed itself guided by destiny. Its failure was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake, the myth of Southern invincibility, so carefully cultivated since the first shots at Manassas, collapsed in an afternoon. Union soldiers who had once doubted their ability to stand toe-to-toe with Lee's veterans now knew they could hold their ground and win. Northern civilians, weary of the war's endless bloodshed, found new resolve in the victory. And in Richmond, far from the field of Pennsylvania, the Confederate government faced a sobering truth. The tide of the war had begun to turn against them. Lee himself understood this more clearly than anyone. On July 4th, with rain falling over the battlefield and his army battered and exhausted, he began the long, painful retreat southward. Wagons loaded with thousands of wounded creaked slowly down muddy roads, guarded by rear guards that expected Union pursuit at any moment. But George Meade, cautious and uncertain, did not immediately follow. The Army of Northern Virginia escaped destruction, but it was a hollow escape. It would never again cross into Union territory on a major offensive. The initiative, once firmly in Confederate hands, now belonged to the North. The consequences of Gettysburg rippled far beyond Pennsylvania. The defeat coincided with another pivotal Union victory, the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, which split the Confederacy in two. Together, these twin blows in the summer of 1863 marked a decisive shift in the war's momentum. The Confederacy, once confident it could secure independence through bold offensives and political pressure, now faced a grim new reality. It would have to fight a defensive war, one of attrition and survival, against an opponent growing stronger by the day. On the ground, the effects of the failed charge were immediate and devastating. Pickett's division was virtually destroyed. Of the 12,000 men who had stepped off that afternoon, more than 6,000 were dead, wounded, or captured. Entire brigades ceased to exist as fighting units. The pride of Virginia soldiery was gone, and with it, a piece of the South's spirit. Letters from soldiers in the aftermath spoke of despair, disillusionment, and a dawning realization that victory might no longer be possible. "We gave all we had," one survivor wrote, "and the enemy did not yield. I fear we cannot do so again." For the Union, Gettysburg was more than a victory. It was proof that perseverance could triumph over audacity. It validated Lincoln's belief that the war could be won not just through superior numbers and resources, but through steadfast resolve. The Army of the Potomac, often maligned for its defeats and missed opportunities, has stood firm against the best the Confederacy could offer and emerged victorious. The confidence born on that ridge would fuel the campaigns that followed, from Grant's relentless push through Virginia to Sherman's march across Georgia. In the years that followed, veterans on both sides would look back on Pickett's charge as a turning point, the moment when the Confederacy's reach exceeded its grasp, when courage alone could no longer compensate for dwindling numbers, resources, and time. It was a high water mark of a cause that, from that day forward, would be forced to fight with its back to the wall. And though the war would rage on for nearly 2 more bloody years, the outcome was, in many ways, sealed on that hot July afternoon when the gray tide broke and rolled back from Cemetery Ridge. The South had gambled everything and lost. The tide had turned, and it would never flow their way again. In the decades that followed the gun's thunder at Gettysburg, the battlefield changed. The scorched soil healed, the splintered fences were mended, and the grass grew tall and green where once it had been trampled and soaked with blood. The war ended, the nation reunited, at least on paper, and the men who had faced one another across that mile of deadly ground grew old. But they did not forget. Year after year, they returned to this place, walking slowly along familiar ridges with canes instead of rifles, wearing medals where once they had carried muskets. And when they reached the angle where the tide of Pickett's charge had crashed and broken, they stopped. Always they stopped. The reunions began quietly. In the 1870s, veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies began to visit Gettysburg together, their hair graying and their uniforms long since replaced by civilian coats. Some came out of curiosity, others out of duty, and still others because something in their souls demanded it. They moved carefully over the ground they had once fought and bled for, pointing out landmarks that no longer existed, a tree that had been shattered by artillery, a fence they had climbed under fire, a patch of earth where a comrade had fallen. And when they reached the low stone wall at the angle, words often failed them. There they stood in silence. Some removed their hats. Others bent down and touched the stones, now weathered and cool beneath their hands. For many, the memories returned with painful clarity. The sight of comrades charging bravely into withering fire, the sound of bullets hissing past their ears, the cries of the wounded and dying, the smoke so thick it turned day into night. They remembered the fear, the chaos, and the terrible courage it had taken to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed to turn back. And they remembered, too, the strange, fierce respect they had felt for the men on the other side, enemies in war, but men who had shared the same ordeal, the same suffering, the same brush with death. It was in these moments, standing side by side where they had once tried to kill one another, that the veterans found a kind of peace. Old soldiers who had once charged across the field as enemies now shook hands over the very wall that had divided them. Union veterans helped Confederate comrades lay wreaths at monuments to their fallen, and Confederates bowed their heads before the graves of the men who had repelled their charge. The bitterness of war never fully disappeared. It lingered in memories and the scars left by a nation torn apart. But on those fields, under the same July sun, something larger took its place. It was a recognition that they had all been part of something far greater than themselves, something that had reshaped the course of their country. The angle became more than a point on a map. It became a symbol of courage and futility, of hope and heartbreak, of the moment when two visions of America collided with all the force they could muster. The men who had fought there knew that the war was not simply about territory or politics. It was about the future of a nation, about whether it would remain divided or become whole again, about whether freedom would be universal or conditional. And they understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the cost of that answer had been measured in human lives, spilled across that quiet Pennsylvania field. By the time the 50th anniversary of the battle arrived in 1913, many of those who returned were frail and bent, their steps slow and uncertain. Yet thousands came. They gathered once again at the angle, where the high water mark of Confederacy had risen and receded. And when a group of aged Union veterans extended their hands across the wall to their former foes, the gesture was met not with hesitation, but with tears and embraces. It was a moment that transcended victory and defeat, a testament to shared sacrifice and to the enduring bond of those who had survived the crucible of war. The fields of Gettysburg are quiet now. The cannons are still, the lines of battle are frozen in bronze and stone, and the grass sways gently where men once fell. But the memory remains in the monuments that mark each regiment's stand, in the letters and diaries that recount the terror and the triumph, and in the silence that still lingers at the angle. There, visitors pause as the veterans once did, listening not for sounds of war, but for the echoes of courage and tragedy that shaped a nation. And as they stand under the same July sun, they, too, feel the weight of what happened there. Not just a battle, but a turning point when the destiny of divided America was rewritten on a ridge of Pennsylvania soil.